Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So today we are beginning the fourth chapter of the ninth canto, and this centers on the pastime in the Bhagavatam. Basically, this and the next chapter will be about the pastime of Ambarish Maharaj. But the first part of it is the lesser known story of Nabhaga. And that's what we will be discussing today. So let's look at, I'm sharing my screen, we'll recite the verse and then we'll move forward. At this stage, what's this? Yeah. So Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 9, Chapter 4, Text 1. Shri Shuka Vacha na bhago nabhaga patyam yam tatam bhratarah kavim yavishtham vyabhajan dayam brahmacharinam agatam. So Shri Shukdev Goswami, word for word synonyms are Shri Shuka Vacha. Shri Shukdev Goswami said, Nabhagah, Nabhag, Nabhag Apatyam was the son of Maharaj Nabhag. Yam, unto whom, Tatam, the father, Bhrataraha, the elder brothers, Kavim, the learned, Yavishtham, the youngest, Vyabhajan, divided, Dayam, the property, Brahmacharinam, having accepted the life of a brahmachari perpetually, Naishtika, Agatam, returned. Translation: Shukdev Goswami said, the son of Nabhag, named Nabhag, lived for a long time at the place of his spiritual master. Therefore, his brothers thought that he was not going to become a grahastha and would not return. Consequently, without providing a share for him, they divided the property of their father among themselves. When Nabhag returned from the place of his spiritual master, they gave him their father as his share. Purport: there are two kinds of brahmacharis. One may return home, marry and become a householder, whereas the other, known as Brihadrata, takes a vow to remain a brahmachari perpetually. The Brihadrata brahmachari does not return from the place of the spiritual master. He stays there and later he directly takes sannyas. Because Nabhag did not return from the place of his spiritual master, his brothers thought he had taken Brihadrat brahmacharya. Therefore, they did not preserve his share. And when he returned, they gave him their father as his share. So, there are a lot of significant minor themes in this session, in this particular story. So, I'll discuss them. I have a PowerPoint, but right now my computer is hanging, so I might not be able to use my PowerPoint. But we will be discussing. So, in this as well as the next session, I'll be focusing on the story of Nabhag, and if we get time, we will move toward the story of Ambarish Maharaj. So now there are broadly within the Bhakti canon, in the Vedic scriptures, there are the Puranas and the Itihasas. And the main difference between the Puranas and the Itihasas are like Ramayana and Mahabharata. The Puranas are Srimad Bhagavatam, Vishnu Puran, Padma Puran. One of the main differences between these two is that the Itihasas are more similar to what we might call history in today's world, in the sense that they are focused generally on one character or one set of characters. Like the Mahabharata is about the Pandavas, Ramayana is about Lord Ram. So it's more focused history. Whereas the Puranas are more like compiled history. So they are speaking from various epochs and various ages and various contexts different stories are drawn together, and sometimes the unifying theme for all those stories is evident from the questions and the context, or sometimes it may not be so evident. But overall, the Bhagavatam, as we know, is a Puran. It's not like a typical Puran. It is called as the Amal Puran. Of course, from the perspective of pure devotion, it emphasizes the pure devotional principles. But as compared to the other Puranas, it is also relatively quite structured and cohesive. So the overall structure of the Bhagavatam is centered on all the questions that are given are all these stories. They are all progressively helping to promote the understanding that how we all are meant to grow toward the point where we can remember Krishna steadily. That is the primary purpose of everything. So how is that purpose served? So if you consider, so there are main stories and there are supplementary stories. So for example, Ram's story is the main story, or we could consider in the Bhagavatam, in terms of length, Krishna's pastimes are the main pastimes, 90 chapters, almost 1/3 of the Bhagavatam in terms of length. And there are other well-known stories, but then there are supplementary stories. Supplementary means that they are additional stories. So there are many stories. Some of these are celebrated stories, some of them are not so celebrated. So now the story of Nabhag is a relatively less celebrated story. And what's happening over here is, why does the Bhagavatam have so many stories like this? In one sense, the Bhagavatam is a chronological flow. In fact, what is the chronology? Basically, we can say that. So I'll be using the PowerPoint also as a whiteboard. From third canto, we could say approximately from 3.78 onward, that means 8th chapter onward, the Bhagavatam is describing one day of Brahma. Overall, from the first Manu onwards, so Ambho Manu onwards, various incidents in one day of Brahma are being described. And as these incidents are being described, the overall stress is not just on describing everything that happened in the day of Brahma. Now, it's impossible to describe everything. Every description of history is a selection of what to describe. Now, if you want to describe even, say, any event in Indian history or in American history for that matter. So, one book can be written about, say, one event such as elections. And one book can be written about one election in one part of the country. One book can be written about one decade. One book can be written about a century. So usually how much detail some story goes, how much detail a person goes into is determined by what the purpose of the book is. So what is the purpose of the Bhagavatam? The Bhagavatam is a spiritual history. It is not history in the modern sense. What do we mean by that? Bhagavatam selects those incidents from history whereby certain uplifting lessons for our ethical and spiritual growth can be taught. And Shukdev Goswami, so he's going along chronologically describing the prominent kings and prominent incidents within the various Manvantaras, the reigns of Manu. But how does he decide what is prominent? That is determined by his purpose. His purpose is to assist Parikshit Maharaj to remember Krishna.
Promise you.
And how does he assist Parikshit Maharaj? By helping him to either have direct pastimes of Krishna or have stories which teach the values that facilitate the remembrance of Krishna. And then there are, so while he's telling those stories, pastimes, some are celebrated stories, like say the story of Prahalad or Dhruva, they're well-known stories. And some are stories of unsung heroes. So Nabhag's story is something like that. We know Vritrasur's story is there in the Veda. It is there in the Vedas itself. But the Bhagavatam focuses on the inner consciousness of Vritrasur. And similarly, here this another story of the story of Nabhag comes over here. And at one level, the story seems to be quite peculiar. So, the story seems to be quite peculiar because overall, it's as if it seems very mundane. So, if I go over quickly over the story before we go into the details of it, and that what happens is that in harmony with the tradition of those times, Nabhag goes to a spiritual master's place for brahmachari training. Now, we know the framework that Srila Prabhupada often talks about in his books: 25 years as brahmachari, then 25 years as grihastha, 25 years as vanaprastha, and 25 years as sannyasi, something like that. Now, in general, life is messy, and because life is messy, reality never translates neatly into any conceptual structure. So Prabhupada himself, if you consider, he didn't exactly take vanaprastha at the age of 50. He took it at a later age, 59, 60. So for so there is a certain structure that is given in scripture, and the lived reality can vary depending on various factors. So we see Krishna, because Krishna's circumstances were exceptional, that Krishna was born and there was a big threat to his life. So he lived in Vrindavan in almost incognito. And therefore, when he came back, he had his Gurukul education had to be accelerated. He had already lost several years, and also he had to protect Mathura from Kamsa's allies. And that's why his Gurukul education, the Gopal Champu describes, was secret. Krishna went without much fanfare to the Gurukul and came back also discreetly. So, and he had, we could say, I have a accelerated learning program where he learned everything very fast. So in real life, things may not always be that static. So that structured, this for this much time, this for this much time. So it seems that all the sons of, so there's Nabhag and Nabhag, the son of Dashrath and Dashratheya. So Dashratheya is Ram. So like that, so these all the sons apparently went to the Gurukul, but some of his sons, or many or most of his sons, came back quickly, whereas Nabhag chose to stay on. So when they chose to stay on, what happened there was that his the family members thought that, especially his brothers thought that he's never going to return. And they divided the property, the inheritance from the king among themselves. So at least in this context, it seems that the king didn't immediately take vanaprastha. Again, I said that structure as described in scripture and as is lived in culture, but there will always be adjustments according to specific situations. So the king was still there in the kingdom. And Prabhupada talks in the purport about two broad conceptions of brahmacharis. There are those who take brahmachari training and come back, and those who take brahmachari training and decide to continue on and eventually take sannyas. Something. So now it seems that Nabhag, it was thought that he was going to be the second category, but he just remained in the Gurukul more than others. And when he came back, his brothers, because they had already divided the kingdom, they decided to give him his father as a share. And that theme of, what does it mean to give a person as a property? And what is it, kind of objectification, or what exactly it is? We will discuss that in due course. But overall, let's look at a little bit more specifics of the story. So what, in general, if we consider the story, might seem peculiar. So what does he do? He gets his father and he says, my father can't be my property. So then he decides to perform a yajna to Lord Shiva, and then he gets some wealth. So the story can be peculiar because in one sense, life itself is peculiar. There's so many unexpected, unpredictable, unmanageable situations that we may face in our life. So currently, for example, the pandemic that is now become an old story, as they are calling it a new normal. Most of us wouldn't have imagined this kind of paralysis of our life, at least at some level, about a year or so ago. So life can throw an unexpected curve at us. When that happens, everybody has to negotiate it in particular ways. So as a prince who's coming back home, he expects a welcome, but he doesn't get a welcome. What he gets is something entirely different. It's just as happens with the Pandavas. The Pandavas don't, when they come back after winning Draupadi's hand, there is justice in name and justice in reality. So the Pandavas, there's a division of property, and the Pandavas get half of the kingdom, but that half is a barren half. So it's an entirely unfair division. So like that, he doesn't get any kingdom. And normally, when somebody comes back to his, their home after a long time, they expect some warm and welcoming situation, but he doesn't get any of that. In fact, he gets the opposite, and he is bewildered. So what happens is, we generally see that there are a lot of power plays wherever there is a royal society. That power plays means that, see, the more power we have, the more we want to play with power. So see, there is, by here, the word play is not used so much in a playful sense, like a sports where we play, but the word play is used in the sense of using something very serious for something relatively frivolous. So when there are power plays, so in every society, there is some set of structure and hierarchy, and some people are given power, and that power is meant to enable everyone to function properly. So there is the police have some power, and they're meant to maintain law and order. The politicians have some power, and they are meant to legislate. In every structure there are some powers. Every social structure there is some power. The kings especially have a huge power, and if we look at the history as described even in a sacred book like Bhagavatam, what to speak of secular history. So there is almost every place where there is power, or especially where there is transfer of power, there is always complication. Sometimes there will be military coups, there will be overthrow, there will be revolutions, there will be violence. So sometimes we may say that, sometimes people may say that, I'm not interested in politics. Well, that's fine. That's a matter of personal interest. We may not be interested in politics, but politics is surely interested in us. What that means is, politics is surely interested in us means that political changes may or may not make things better, but political changes can surely make things worse. If there are, now we could say there are good people and bad people, or there are bad people and worse people. But there is a difference between people who are selfish or self-centered and people who are outright tyrannical. So in this case, his brothers are not evil exactly. We see that the Kauravas were evil, and they tried to poison Bhima, or they tried to burn the Pandavas along with their mother alive. They did devious things. Now, in contrast with that, in the Ramayana, if we see, Kaikeyi was not exactly evil. She was selfish, self-seeking, and in that process of being self-seeking, she did something heinous. In this case, his brothers seem to be more manipulative than outright evil, but they just want to trick and leave him with nothing. So the Srila Prabhupada writes in the third canto purport that life can be so complex, especially in the section of the pastime of teachings of Kapil Dev about the stresses of material existence. He says that life can be so tough that even trying to just live responsibly, live respectably, earning a livelihood can be very, very difficult. And the more complex our society becomes, the more complex power plays are involved. There is a saying that uneasy is the head that wears a crown. Uneasy is the head that wears a crown. That means if there is a crown, those who want to grab a crown, they won't just grab the crown, they may lop off the head to get the crown. So there is always that fear. Paradoxically, what happens is the more we play with power, the more power plays with us. And in this particular narrative, the Bhagavatam doesn't go too much into describing the specific characters of Nabhag's brothers, but that's the point that they're trying to deprive him. So what happens is we may start seeking power with some virtuous intention, but sooner or later the virtuous intention gets lost, and we start using or abusing the power. So that's how things go downhill quite often. So now if we consider this point, that there is a hunger for power. Now power can have many different meanings. Usually we talk about political power in terms of somebody winning elections, but there are many different kinds of power. There can be technological power, where if somebody gets a weapon of mass destruction, that can change the whole dynamic of how others treat them with people. So what happens is, so if there's hunger for power and there's hunger for something big, this is a little complicated. There's hunger for something bigger than power. So when there is what it's quite often we seek, now power can also be financial power in terms of having money, that when people want money, they do things with money. So there is hunger for power and there is hunger for something bigger than power. So having power is okay, but what are we doing with the power is far more important. And if that is not clear, then that power starts consuming us, and that power starts abusing, we start abusing that power. So in this case, there could be these broad four possibilities, that when there is power and there is hunger for power, that if there is a purpose bigger than power that we are seeking, that we are pursuing, then we will use the power properly. But if there is no higher purpose, then just the exercise of power can itself be quite intoxicating. It can be quite intoxicating. Sometimes children get some new toys, and then initially say the child is, gets a toy which you press certain buttons and certain noises come. And initially the child presses a button and a certain noise comes. It's a little triggered. If you're small babies are just getting the handle of what life is all about. There's a toy and they're fascinated by the toy. They press this button and suddenly this noise comes. Press that button and that noise comes. Oh, this is what happens. But as they start playing with it more and more, then it can be very intoxicating. And if somebody has the buttons for power and they can do quite dangerous things with that power, then it can be very troublesome. So in this case, what happens is, everybody is pursuing power at some level or the other. Some people may be pursuing intellectual power, and some people may be pursuing social power in various ways, through contacts, through connections. So whatever is required, that is fine. People may pursue it, but why they are pursuing, what we are pursuing is not as important as what we are pursuing. So if there is, so in this case, the Bhagavatam is overall illustrating there are two broad themes that are illustrated in the Bhagavatam, that there are wrongdoers, and in general, the mood of the Bhagavatam, especially because the Bhagavatam is focused on facing death. So the focus of the Bhagavatam is not so much seeking justice in this world. That means, not seeking justice in this world means, we don't see when Parikshit Maharaj is cursed by Shamik Rishi's son Shringi, that he is not court-martialed, or he is not brought before a court for abuse of power. Clearly by him there is abuse of power. So But what happens is, he is not so much corrected, because the whole point is that the Bhagavatam is focusing, yes, there is a time for seeking justice in this world, but there is also a time for focusing primarily on doing justice to our souls. That means, okay, people may have done unjust things to us, but maybe there is a time to just forget everything and focus on our own spiritual growth. So when Parikshit Maharaj was a king, at that time his focus was entirely on making sure that justice was established. In fact, he was a very responsible, resourceful ruler who would go out into the city, going out in the kingdom and look for the unscrupulous elements, antisocial elements, and that's how he caught Kali in action and curbed him. But eventually, when it became clear that he was going to die, and he accepted that as his fate, then he didn't pursue it any further. He accepted it. So he didn't. So similarly, overall in the Bhagavatam, the mood is, yes, there are people who do bad things. Sometimes they're evil, and that's why they do bad things. Sometimes they do bad things simply because they go through a bad phase. They give in to their lower desires. So we see Chitraketu's son, whom he had sought for so long and got after such effort. Chitraketu's son was killed by his own co-wives. And the Bhagavatam doesn't go into describing how they were punished, because the focus of the Bhagavatam in this context is different. That how material arrangements don't lead to any significant growth. That is the theme of the Bhagavatam. And because of that, the Bhagavatam doesn't go in that direction at all. And beyond that, we see that the thrust of the Bhagavatam is, okay, whatever bad thing has happened, how do we move ahead in our lives? How can we seek to grow spiritually? So that's the focus in the Bhagavatam. Now we are analyzing it from the perspective that how at this particular stage he is misunderstood. So he is misunderstood, or now whether that is intentional or that is incidental, that's difficult to say. But overall, we all have a certain set of actions that we do, and a certain set of actions that we are expected to do. And based on whether there is a expectation and there is the individual action or the individual inclination and the social expectation, to the extent both of them go together, to that extent there is positivity and growth. To the extent they don't grow together, then there is so it can be either the individual is disrupted or the society is disrupted. So sometimes the individual may feel curbed, sometimes society may malfunction. So overall, there has to be a harmony between both. Say if we are a part of a community and somebody never participates much in the community, they stay in their own space, and then maybe people may invite sometimes, and if that person doesn't come, they say, okay, maybe that person doesn't want to be much of part of the community, so let them be alone. So we read people's actions, and based on that, we decide how best to function in our interactions with them. So what happens overall is, whenever we are functioning, there is this combination of we keep making presumptions about others. So everyone has their own criteria. So if we are studying scriptures together and somebody doesn't come to study scripture with us, if we form a group for studying scripture and nobody comes over there, maybe that person is not interested in that. If we have Harinam and a person never comes from Harinam, okay, maybe this person is not interested in that. Then that is a reasonable inference. but everybody has their own criteria about what others' desires and interests are. So what happens if we consider there is the individual inclination and there's the social expectation, and when both are met, okay, you are playing this, you are best suited to play this role. Somebody is a good singer, somebody is a good speaker, and they get that role accordingly. And then if somebody is going to be a good singer or is going to play the role of a singer or a speaker, then there are certain expectations from that person of how they should be behaving. So when the individual inclination and the social expectation are in harmony, then there is growth. Then there's actually harmony and there is growth over there. But when, say, when a person focuses only on their individual inclination but doesn't at all get concerned about social expectation, then there is social malfunction. That society can't move forward if we are not, if everybody is just doing that entire thing, then we don't have a society. We just have a group of individuals living together, but it's not a society. So, but if there is only the social expectation that is being met, but the individual inclination is not being catered to, then the individual feels curbed, the individual feels crushed or suppressed. And if neither are met, then everything is very disharmonious. So why am I talking about this? Oh, yes, Prabhu.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
You brought up an interesting point about how sometimes people do things that's inappropriate, and that we have to deal with that in this world. But an interesting might be everything you said was very good. One moral we might derive from this is that Krishna is so wonderful that the brothers, they split out from their brahmachari service to get home and cut up the wealth, right? But he stayed and pursued spiritual practice and study and service to the spiritual master, and he wasn't hurrying for that. But then Krishna, so wonderful that there was no loss for him, right? That Krishna arranged to take care of him, even though he didn't focus on material acquisition, which he might have needed for his householder ashram. The brothers did something else, but he just did his sadhana, served his
Yes.
guru, stayed in the ashram, came late for the material, cut up, but Krishna is so kind and considering, made an arrangement for him. Anyway, just a comment.
Yes, bro. Thank you.
Say
It's a
something.
valid point. Yes,
Krishna.
sir. Thank you. It's a very valid point. Thank you. So I was taking this more from the perspective of how his brother, if we give his brothers the benefit of the doubt, that they thought, like Prabhupada talks about two kinds of brahmachari. So they thought that he was going to be the second kind of brahmachari and he's not going to come back. So that was a social expectation. That's what his brothers thought he's going to do. And but when he came back, it created disturbance. And when there's a disturbance, then we have to deal with that. So the way they dealt with it is, suppose say we are expecting say 50, we are having a program where we're expecting 50 people and we cook accordingly. And then suddenly 200 people come. Then what do we do at that time? So there's some disruption. What is expected and what actually happens. So his brothers had to deal with that that disruption between, or that distance between what was the expectation, what was the actual reality. And the way they dealt with it was in a by neglecting what Nabhag had to, by neglecting Nabhag's role, and now they had to set things up properly. So as I mentioned, if the individual inclination and social expectation go together, there's harmony and growth. In this case, this is what the quadrant was, that the individual, he felt curbed. He says, I have nothing. How can I live like this? So in general, whether his brothers were intentionally or circumstantially motivated, whether they were evil or whether they were just opportunistic, and then they had to deal with the situation. What happens is, quite often the nature of greed for wealth, greed for property, leads to what the Bhagavatam says, that artha is often the source of anartha. Now artha doesn't have to be the source of anartha. In the Bible it is said that money is the source of evil. That's the way the saying is often quoted, but the actual saying is the greed for money is the source of evil. Artha is not necessarily going to lead to anartha. The Bhagavatam says artha can also be used to dharmasya apavargasya na artho arthayo upakalpatya. Arthasya dharmaikantasya kamo labhaya hi smritaha, that everything can be used for transcendence. But quite often, the nature of the world is that artha leads to anartha. And the way to deal with this, let's make a couple of points and then we'll continue tomorrow about how this perplexity was resolved for him. That when artha leads to anartha, what actually happens is that we can use relation money to build bridges. When we love, when we care for someone, if we have resources, we can use those resources, just financial resources, for doing things for others, and that can build bridges. But sometimes the same money can build walls, because they say what happens is, once money comes, every people can become very suspicious. Oh, this person is after my money, that person is after my money, that person is after my money, and then they protect themselves. Now the nature of walls is, the walls can protect, but the walls can also restrict. It depends on what is there inside. There can be walls around a fortress, which protect, and there can be walls around a prison which restrict. So when artha, so what we are doing inside the walls is important. That's why, going back to the earlier point of what is the purpose that one is cultivating, that is important. And if the purpose is good, then things can move forward positively. So in the case of Nabhag, he had spiritual training, and with his spiritual training, he decided that uh, I'm going to come back and do my duties in the world. But he had to make some arrangement, because when his brothers gave him his father. Now, what does it mean to give the father? I'll discuss that theme of objectification before we conclude this. That he basically meant that his father is he is your property. So now his father says in the next verses, it describes that I'm not your property, I'm not your inheritance. So then what do you do? How do you get inheritance? So he has to make some other arrangement for that. So the idea is that in relationships, sometimes there may be a proprietary mood in it, a possessive mood in it. Now that can either be an unhealthy mentality, or it can be also healthy if it's bringing out a sense of responsibility and caring. That may be healthy. But if it brings a sense of entitlement or domination, then it can be unhealthy. So when his brothers tried to weasel a way out of giving him or redividing the property, then he didn't confront them, but he achieved his needs in an appropriate way. And what that way was, we'll discuss in the next session. So to summarize, what I discussed today was broadly three main points. The first point was about the presence of these supplementary or lesser known stories in the Bhagavatam. That the Bhagavatam is Purana. Purana is not focused history on one character or one set of characters, but it is compiled history centered around some theme. So the theme from a chronological perspective in the Bhagavatam is to describe one day of Brahma. From a conceptual perspective is that describe the various histories or various stories in history that teach spiritual values of how one can pursue spiritual growth, remember Krishna, and ultimately attain Krishna. And there are some stories which are lesser known stories, and Nabhag's story is one of the lesser known stories. And in discussing the story of Nabhag, we discussed 2 points primarily. First was about the principle that each of us, everybody is seeking power in different ways: financial, technological, political, social. So when that power is being sought, for what purpose that power is being sought is more important, and that will determine how that power is used. So otherwise the power can be very easily abused. The more power we have, the more we feel like playing with power, because it gives us, as children like to fiddle with toys. It's exhilarating to see things happen because of the power that we have. But then the more we play with power, we get hooked to it, and the power starts playing with us. So just as there is power struggle, uneasy is the head that wears the crown. So throughout in almost every royal dynasty, there is some kind of power struggles that happen, and not just in every dynasty, almost every generation, even in sacred books that is depicted in quite graphic ways. And then sometimes some people are outright evil, some people are not evil, but others might not be evil, but they may be opportunistic. So his brothers divide the property among themselves because they expect him to stay as a lifelong brahmachari, but he comes back a little later. So we talked about how standard structures is described in scripture, like 25 years of the 4 ashrams. When they're translated into reality, into real life, there will be always adjustments according to time, place, circumstance. So he comes back later, and then he has nothing with him, and that causes a disturbance. So the disturbance is that, what will I do with, I have no property, what will I do? So when our individual inclination or individual role, expectation of what we want to do, and social expectation of what we should be doing, when that both goes in together, there's a harmony and growth. Otherwise there is disruption. So sometimes it's the society that can get disrupted if the individual is too self-centered. If the society is not giving anything for the individual, then the individual may feel crushed, curbed or crushed. So this is what happens. And because the overall Bhagavatam's mood is not so much to seek justice in the world, but as to seek justice for the soul by purification and elevation toward Krishna. So generally, there is not so much external measures to punish wrongdoers, although that is there also, but that's not the primary thrust in the Bhagavatam. The primary thrust is inner transformation. So Nabhag doesn't get into a confrontation, but still has his needs addressed. And how that happens, we'll discuss in the next session.